Can you hear us?
A true horror story from the Blackwell's Island Lunatic Asylum. Whispers from the padded cell. There are places that should be forgotten. Places that have sunk too deep into the shadows of the past to be brought back into the light. Blackwell's Island Lunatic Asylum was one of these places. Built in 1839 on an isolated island in the middle of New York's East River, the sanatorium was intended to be a refuge for the mentally ill. But anyone who reads the dusty reports stored in the dark archives of the city library soon learns that it was not a place of healing. It was a place of fear, a prison for souls who were never released. I started researching Blackwell's out of sheer curiosity. An old newspaper story from 1872 had caught my attention. It reported a mysterious series of silenced patients. Without warning, they had stopped speaking, stopped responding. Doctors described it as a strange epidemic of silence. But between the lines of these dusty reports, there was something else. One name kept cropping up. Margaret Riordan was a simple nurse, not a genius, not a madwoman, just a woman trying to survive in this dark asylum. In the years she worked at Blackwell's, she wrote regularly in her diary. The few pages that have survived give a disturbing insight into what went on there. The first entry I found is dated February 4th, 1871.
Something is wrong with the new patients. They're sitting quietly in their cells, not saying a word. But at night, I swear I can hear them whispering.
At first she thought it was her imagination. The asylum was a dark, ominous place where the shadows were deep and the screams behind the walls were often real. But the whispers were different.
It's not a normal whisper. It's more than a whisper. It's everywhere. I hear it even when the patients are asleep.
Between January and March 1871, a total of 14 patients fell silent. Men and women from different parts of the city. Some had been admitted due to mental illness. Others were simply unwanted. Beggars, whores, war invalids. People that society wanted to forget. They ate. They slept. They moved. But they never spoke again. Margaret Riordan was the only one who asked questions. Why did they become mute? Why all at once?
When I go into their rooms, they look at me with those empty, dead eyes. They breathe, but sometimes it seems like they don't really breathe.
One of these patients was William Pritchard, a former teacher who was admitted due to hallucinatory delusions. According to the files, he had spent the entire night in his bed, mute, staring at the ceiling with his eyes open. But bite marks were found on his tongue, as if he had tried to silence himself. Then came the night of March 3rd, 1872. Margaret Riordan lay in her bed, wrapped in a thin, scratchy blanket. The gas lamps in the hallway had already been extinguished, and only the pale moonlight filtered through the dirty windows of her small room. But something was keeping her awake. The whispering was back, but this time it was different. It was no longer just a soft murmur from the cells, no longer just an unintelligible murmur from the cracks in the walls. It was everywhere. It was in the wind that swept through the broken windows. It was in the soft drip of water falling into rusty buckets in the corners of the asylum. It was in her head.
Margaret?
Her name. Quiet, gentle, almost like a breath right next to her ear.
Margaret?
She froze. It wasn't her imagination. Her heart began to race as she buried herself under her blanket and pressed her hands over her ears. But it didn't help. The voices weren't outside her. They were inside her. It felt as if someone was gently placing their fingers on her forehead, as if cold breath was stroking her skin. Then came darkness. Margaret Riordan was never seen again. When Margaret didn't turn up for her ward round the next morning, a nurse went into her room. The door was ajar. The bed had been made. Too neat. No signs of a struggle. No signs of violence. But Margaret was gone. The doctors and staff searched the entire asylum. They searched the empty corridors, the decaying pantries, even the cellar where the rats lived. There was no sign of her. A person can't just disappear, not without noise, not without a clue. And yet the only thing they found was a small, tattered notebook lying on her bedside table, her diary. They leafed through it. Her notes were meticulous, methodical, right down to the last page. The last note consisted of a single sentence.
The mute hear him. Soon I will too.
The words were not written shakily. No sign of panic, no hurry. She had written them calmly, almost accepting. But who was he? And what had she heard? After Margaret's disappearance, the mute patients became increasingly weaker. None of them ever spoke again. They lived in their strange, wordless existence. Some smiled, others wept silently, without a single tear. One by one, they died. Some were simply found in their beds, their eyes wide open as if they had gazed into the abyss. Others had mutilated themselves as if they were desperately trying to get something out of themselves. Strange events were reported until the asylum closed in 1930. Doctors reported quiet voices in the dark corridors. Nurses refused to enter certain cells where the silenced patients were once housed. Some claimed that they sometimes saw people at night who were not supposed to be there, just shadowy silhouettes that disappeared into the shadows if you got too close. In 1954, a reporter ventured into the abandoned ruins of Blackwell's. He wanted to prove that all this was just superstition. He spent the night alone in one of the old patients' rooms. The next morning, he published his report. I laughed when I heard the stories about the whispering. Then I spent the night in one of the old cell rooms. I heard it too. And in the silence of the night, I felt my own lips moving. A year later, he was found dead. At his desk, a pen in his hand. He had only written 2 words on a piece of paper: he speaks. Historians and psychologists have long tried to find a rational explanation for the silent epidemic of 1871 to 1872. Some believe it was a collective psychosis triggered by the horrific conditions at Blackwell's. The inhumane treatment, isolation, and fear may have driven the patients into a self-imposed state of silence. Others suspect an unknown disease, perhaps an early form of encephalitis or a neurological disorder that damaged the speech center in the brain. But then, there are those who hold a darker theory. Margaret Riordan heard the whispering before she disappeared. The patients no longer spoke, but they moved their lips. And even decades later, the soft whispers could still be heard from the dilapidated cells. Was it a voice? Was it a presence? Or was it a being? The ruins of Blackwell's no longer exist. The buildings have been demolished, the island remodeled. But some say that if you listen carefully, even today, a soft whisper on the wind. And if you're unlucky enough to hear it, listen carefully, because maybe your lips will be the next to move.